Well, good. All right, guys. So yeah, Romans 1. We're gonna just spend a little time in Romans 1. We're gonna jump around a little bit. This is something that I observed. I don't think it was the first time I observed this was last week, but I definitely spent some time looking at it last week, and it was encouraging, and I thought it'd be encouraging to you. So we're gonna look at it together, and it starts with this conversation regarding the word godliness, or the opposite, ungodliness. And I bring it up because in verses 18 through 25, the same Greek term that's translated ungodliness occurs, and there's different English translations of it. And so we're gonna do a little bit of a word study together this morning in order to see the goodness of the gospel. One of the ways to do that is via word study, because sometimes I'm trying to think how do I put this. If you've ever, some of you haven't really had any reason to do this, but if you've ever studied communication or public speaking, which obviously a preacher has to do to some extent, even if it's just on their own time, they sort of think about it and analyze it. But anyone who's ever done any public speaking, I mean, you think about your technique and approach, and then if you're both writing and speaking, then you tend to, as you try to develop your ability, you tend to recognize about yourself certain patterns. Just like anything else, like if you're involved in sports, you probably see, okay, I have some weaknesses, I have some blind spots I need to work on. Well, like any other part of life, like any other discipline, you realize that you have certain go-tos. So that just, generally speaking, is applicable to everyone in every realm of whatever, ability, growth, productivity. Well, another part of it is kind of, and you can see this in the New Testament because these are human beings that God inspired, but they have different styles, they have different ways of communicating to different authors, Paul, Peter, John, and along with that, they have different go-to terms, I guess you would say. I mean, if you listen to certain preachers or certain public speakers, you might notice they have filler words, or they have words that they often use, and you would notice that they have within their vocabulary, again, these sort of go-to words. Well, in one sense, when you look at Paul, or you look at the Apostle John or Peter, you'll see they have styles, they have terms that they use more frequently than other writers might use them. And Paul, one of the ways to understand what he's communicating is to look at his word choices, what words he's using, and then to kind of look at where he uses that same word and how he uses that same word. And in doing that, you get a greater, richer, more nuanced understanding of what he's conveying about the gospel. And that can be a really enjoyable, it's probably not something everybody would be inclined to do, to break all that down in great detail, but if you are inclined to do that, boy, that can be a really valuable and enriching study, and it helps you to see different facets of the gospel truth in ways that are pretty compelling. Thinking of the ladies' Bible study, we talk a lot about how they've been in Romans a long time. Well, Ronnie's really geared to kind of dig into those details and bring out those different nuances. And in a lot of our conversations, it's encouraged me to go back and trace throughout how Paul uses some of these words. And when you look at those uses, it's amazing the picture that emerges. Janelle's she's been in that study for a long time. You see that, right, Janelle? You guys look at those terms, and it's amazing the connections. Even, not only within Paul, but when you look at when Paul goes back to the Old Testament, which he knew his Old Testament in both Hebrew, but he also knew the Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint. Well, and we'll see even in our study, is it in the sermon? I think in the sermon he quotes the Septuagint. At any rate, as he quotes the Old Testament, some of those same terms, if you trace them throughout, you see this beautiful redemptive picture being painted by the usage of words. So, words are very important. These tools by which we communicate are very important. And Paul had his own arsenal, or what would you call it? His own inventory of words that he used to convey gospel truth. And this one is a key one. And I'm going to put an asterisk by this. And I'm just going to do this right here. Question mark as to, wait a minute, there's something to look at. There's a question, a mystery kind of regarding this term. So I don't usually do this because we're not trying to be like, the word pedantic, like not trying to show off, but look, the reality is it was originally written in Greek, okay? Romans was written in Greek, so we have translations in English, and we have a whole bunch of different translations. But we're going to key in this morning and look at this word that is translated almost always godliness, or the opposite, ungodliness. In the original, it is this, sabia or asabia. And if you know, it's kind of like in English you would say, if you add the prefix un or non, you're negating. You're speaking of the opposite of whatever you're adding none, on or non to, okay? Well, in Greek, they have this little, it's called an alpha privative. It's like a negation. So this is the opposite of that, okay? So it's translated often this way, sabia, godliness, asabia, ungodliness. But I want us to grapple with whether or not that's the best translation, not because any of us are ever going to be translators, but because of understanding gospel truth. There's something crucial to see here, and the context paints this awesome picture that if we're not careful, we can miss. All right, now all that to say, let's just take a minute, and if you can focus in on how you have heard this word, how you've understood this word or this word. How could you say some things about it? And maybe you're nervous now to say anything about it, but what would you say that means? Godliness or ungodliness. How have you understood it historically in your life, in your Christian experience? How do you understand it now? I mean, anything you want to say about that? What do you, when you hear it, what do you think of, I guess?
Taking on his nature or his character.
Okay. Like taking on God's nature or character? Okay. And what would be an example of that? Like what would be a taking on of his?
Kindness and mercy and grace.
I'm going to just do that. Okay. Kindness.
Holiness.
Okay. Holiness. Okay. Any other attributes or that you think of, or if not, and that's sufficient, let's just do this, etc. How's that? Okay. I mean, literally in English, godliness or ungodliness, it's really related to the idea of godlikeness or ungodlikeness. Okay. So it would lead you to think about a likeness or a lack of likeness. Unlikeness to God. Anything else you would say about that? Any other, I don't know, does it have any connotations to you? Does it have does it feel a certain way? That's a weird thing to explore, but let's say we're in 2022, right, Todd? We're in the day of feelings. So how does it feel to you? Does it feel like a positive word, negative word, makes me feel proud, makes me feel ashamed, anything like that, or nothing? Challenged, okay.
Behavioral related.
Okay, interesting, okay. Behavioral, challenged, Rachel, you said, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Aunt Therese, I see you nodding about you. Anything, what's going on in your mind? I'm putting you on the spot. Is there anything? Does it make you feel anything? That you'd be willing to share? If not, it's fine.
Well, first of all, I was thinking of perfect. I don't know why, but...
Okay. Like godliness makes you think of like perfection?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. It's good. Okay. So let's do this now. I mean, I think we have any other things you want to add?
Sometimes I just try to figure out what God likes and dislikes and try to get in his head.
Okay.
That's a better way of saying that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how to say that.
Okay.
Perspective. Having his perspective.
His perspective. Okay. That's interesting, because that's interesting. We might come back around to that. Okay. All right. So let's kind of keep this here for now, as a listing that's limited, but at least illustrative of some of how we've thought about this word. And I would agree with a lot of these thoughts and even, if we could say, feelings. All right. Okay, so let's read Romans, actually, why don't we start a little earlier than verse 18? Let's do this because this will allow us to context some more. I don't know why it is. I have typed my password at least 1,000,000 times, and I always get it wrong the first couple times. Okay.
Nice.
I'm going to defend my MacBook, and I'm going to attribute it to operator error. How's that? How's that for
You need to
humility?
enable the keychain. That's why.
All that stuff makes me nervous.
Well, it should.
And well, it should. What's that?
You use it, come back.
Here, I'll aim the apple right at you so you can see that right in your face. All right, so Romans 1, let's start at verse 15. And let's read just verses 15 through 17 for starters. Can someone do that for us? 15 to 17, let's start there.
That's why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are at Rome. I see your glasses. I should have volunteered to read.
You're
I'm
fine.
not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God unto salvation of everyone who believes, first the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteousness will live by faith.
Okay, good. So this is Paul in his introduction saying, hey, I am eager, Romans, to preach the gospel to you. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. And then when we look at this in detail many, many months ago when we started Romans, we said, follow his logic here. How is it or why is it the power of God to salvation? Well, verse 17. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed or unveiled. God, through the gospel, shows us his righteousness. And that has something to do with our deliverance. Our rescue comes by virtue of God revealing his righteousness. So that's Paul's topic. And from beginning to end of this letter, he is all about the gospel and explaining it and illustrating it and borrowing from the Old Testament and teaching about the, basically teaching the intention of the Old Testament. There's all these different angles. And as I started this discussion earlier talking about his words, all his word choices relate to tools he's using to try to paint this picture, to put before us this gospel, this good news concerning primarily the unveiling of God's righteousness. Okay, so that's what he's up to. Now, let's read verses 18 through 25. And even before I read it, let me show you where a form of this term here is used in this section we're going to look at. Okay? One of them is obvious, one of it's not as obvious in the English, but it's the same Greek root. One is a noun, the other one's a verb, but nevertheless, it's the same root. Okay? It's this root right here, basically. This S-E-B in English. Okay? So it occurs first in verse 18, translated ungodliness. And that's why we started the conversation saying, hey, it's most often translated this way. I looked at, in my Bible software, I can line up different translations together. And almost every one I saw, it was translated this way in verse 18. Okay, so it occurs there. The verb form of it occurs in verse 25. Anyone have a guess as to what word in verse 25 is the English translation for the Greek verb coming from that root? Does anyone have a guess in verse 25? What is it?
Dishonorable?
Nope.
Exchange.
Nope. Not exchanged. Any other guesses?
Worship.
Yeah. It's worship in verse 25. Okay. So, all right. Same root. Same exact term. It's like if I were to talk about a swimmer, I could use it as a noun, swimmer. Or I could say swimming, which is the verb. It's the same swim as in both, right? Same word. Okay, it's the same word in the original. It's from that same root. Okay, let's read it. Verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. Therefore God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. And here is verse 25. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Okay, so the word's used twice. This is Paul beginning to describe what is essentially wrong with humankind. What is wrong with creatures? Fallenness, depravity, unrighteousness, all these different terms we could use. He's unpacking the problem, that from which we need to be saved. And we start at the beginning with verses 15 and following. Paul says, hey, this is the gospel, this is God's salvation, this is God revealing himself to you. Well, verse 18 and following and this is why you need that salvation. And he begins with the idea of suppressing the truth and the ideas of ungodliness, the English, and he also uses the term unrighteousness. But for our purposes, we're zeroing in on this one, ungodliness. In terms of that human problem, that essential problem, it's interesting when we talked about this term, the way we have interpreted it, or what it makes us think or feel, kind of has to do with attributes, God's attributes, likeness or an unlikeness to God. Todd, I think, was the one who said it's a behavioral term. It feels very behavioral. It tends to have implications for behavior. Can't remember if it was Rachel who said it's challenging. It feels challenging. It feels like there's kind of a standard that then I'm being compared to. Teresa, I think you said perfection, right? It's like it makes you think of God's perfection and then kind of our obligation with regard to his perfection in some sense, I think. So that's how we have understood. That's what our impression is when we hear that term. Is it interesting to you that when in verse 18 the English uses this, in verse 25 when it uses the verb, it's this? True or false, that sounds and feels different than this. Does to me. I mean, maybe there's a way to harmonize this, but I think initially, without overthinking it, it seems very different. Okay. Can someone turn to Acts 16? And someone else turn to Acts 18. So who has Acts 16? Who wants to volunteer to read a verse? It's just one verse in Acts 16. Amanda, all right, could you read verse? Amanda's got 16, 14. Intrice, do you want to get 18?
Okay.
And it'll be verse 7 and then later verse 13. But let's go to Amanda first. It was 16, 14. Go ahead, Amanda. Can you read that verse?
One who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul.
Okay, so there's Lydia, and it says, how was she described? How was she characterized? One who...
A worshiper of God.
She was a worshiper of God. It's the same term. Okay, Intrice, let's go to 18, verse 7, and then verse 13.
Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. Cyprus, the synagogue ruler, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard him believed and were baptized.
Okay, so worshiper of God, the same term again. And then verse 13.
This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law.
Okay, so that was an accusation against the gospel preacher, but again, the term is worship, right? Later in Acts 19, it's used of like a pagan. I think it's there, it's used of a pagan worshiper. So the word, if you were to look it up, it literally has to do with worship, a revering, you know the term venerating. It has to do with venerating. It's that idea. Okay? And I just had us read those just as examples where in the book of Acts it clearly has to do with worship. Not really, although it has implications for behavior, it always does, but that's not really the denotation of the word, what the word actually speaks of directly. Let me have someone turn to Jude. Haven't been there in a while. Jude verse 18, where there's only one chapter in Jude. So I'll have someone turn to Jude verse 18. Who's got that one? Thanks, Rachel. So you turn there and just stay put there for a minute. And let me just say, while you're turning there, go back with me to Romans in your mind and think of, okay, Paul's saying the essence of our sin problem, why we need to be saved. He uses the word unrighteousness, but he also uses this term. We're coming to see that, well, okay, this term really has to do with this issue of worship. You could say respect, but it's kind of like a respect with regard to a deity, okay? Reverence.
What's coming to my mind was, us putting in ourselves in our rightful place, or recognizing that we have a rightful place in terms of. Yeah, so it's kind of an action was just, your mind, realizing. But there's a conundrum there, because our rightful place is perfect in Christ, but also lowly in, as a sinner. So.
Because I'm going to write this, okay? So if this is the human heart, this is the fallen human heart, the heart in need of salvation. You could call it the fleshly heart, the old Adam heart, whatever, however you want to, label it. Paul's been clear about, both through the use of this term, also some other language in Romans 1. Any other language come to mind that would indicate that there's a root false worship problem? Any other language in Romans 1 make you think of that? And you can look down at it if you want and sort of grab anything from what we just read, or the surrounding context. Anything at all kind of speak to that?
They profess to be wise, they were profess to worship
Okay.
themselves.
Self-worship in a way, they're trusting in their own wisdom. What do we do with the glory of God?
Exchange it.
Exchange the glory of God, and in exchange for what? So if we give away His glory, we replace it with?
Worship of the created.
Yeah, worship of the created things. And that's explicit in the verses we looked at, explicit in verse 25, but also the surrounding context paints that same picture and he gives examples of the different, the taxonomy of the different created creatures going back to Genesis. And it's like this idea that we just worship what God's made. We put it in His place. We value it more than the Creator Himself. And along with that false worship, which is clearly a root issue, a huge part of what's gone awry with us humans, there's along with that this idea of lusts, passions, which are other words for what would be another synonym for lusts, passions, desires. If you were to look at Romans 1 there, you see it over and over again. He keeps mentioning this idea of these enslaving lusts that are all part of this false worship issue. Just go right along with it, the package deal. Okay? Okay, so now, Rachel, you've got Jude, verse 18, right? Could you read that?
they said to you, in the last time there will be scoffers, following their own ungodly passions.
Okay, what do you think that word ungodly is? Obviously, it's the same term. Their own, let's translate it, irreverent or unworshipful passions, lust. You see, they go together. It's not just Paul. This is New Testament. It is truth. And this is timeless truth. And this goes all the way back to the beginning. And to be...
They're worshiping something, but not God.
And think about the way that we're made. We're made as dependent creatures, right? So we're dependent upon creation around us to sustain our lives. And then, of course, we also have many ways of pursuing pleasure by virtue of whether eating, other types of experience with creation. So there's the issue of just our dependence, our need. I love the illustration where people say, hey, even the top athletes, the most impressive human beings there are, they cannot go without food and water very long. They cannot go without sleep very long. Or whatever strength, whatever ability, it's completely nullified. We're a joke. Like we're literally that dependent. So there's the dependence, and then there's this regular pursuit of this endeavor to find satisfaction and to find security. And so we, in our worship of created things, we are perpetually chasing, experiencing, partaking of created things. And that's, as we like to say, we try to be careful and nuanced here. Like that's a good part of God's creation, but it's also something that we pervert in our humanness. And so what happens is, in our false worship, in elevating the value and devaluing God himself, we end up enslaved by all these desires. So that is like one of the best ways to just think clearly about what is essentially the root human problem, the core human problem. Yeah, Matt.
I think it was in the men's group where we were going through this. I forget which sort of terms, but you talked about how sort of in the exchange and knowing God that, in a sense, it's a, you know what, God, I get it, but you're not that great. And so what I really want is these other things, and
Right.
just sort of knowing and a rejection of him and his character.
Right. Yeah, it even uses that very terminology of knowing him. This is sort of what we do with him. It's like, I'm not that impressed. Or there's one place where it says we refuse to hold God in our knowledge. It's like, well, let's just kind of dismiss him from the room of our own heads. So this is the human problem. There's this close relationship between false worship and being enslaved to our passions and desires. Conceptually it rings true, experientially it rings true. It goes deeper than simply a list like this. It is truly this issue of the heart. And now I want you to recall how we started with Paul's gospel introduction when he says, the gospel is the blank of God unto salvation. Do you remember what the term was? What is the word? Say again.
Power.
It's the power of God unto salvation. Let's see. So, God's gospel, God's power unto salvation. You could translate it this way. God's ability unto salvation. Okay, so far, any thoughts, anything else you want to say about the essence of the problem, Paul's goal to communicate the good news of what God has done about the problem, the relationship? Well, I got an idea of what we can do actually. But first, anything else you want to say about this problem side of things?
I was just observing, like, we're exchanging, like, we're created to worship, and to be like him, or we want to live independently. But even that, like, we're just choosing to worship his stuff, like, that he created. Like, there's this great God, and we're like, we don't want you, we just want your stuff. And even still, we can't be God on our own. Like, we're just incapable. We can't live without him sustaining us.
I always think of, Christmas morning. The kids, all the toys under the tree, and enamored with all the toys, and like the parents who sacrificed and worked hard to provide for those, they're just an afterthought, or not even, in the picture until it comes time to build whatever the toy is or whatever. Then they're useful again. Hey, I do need you for a second here, actually. And so often, how often is this the case where we're, even the way we view God or the way we pray, it's like, okay, God, could you just keep kind of delivering the goods to me here? So that's our nature, right? Okay, just for fun, I'm realizing we don't have as much time as I thought we had, but I think we can still do this briefly. So jump ahead in chapter 1. Now let's just, for a moment, look at the list when he says they are filled with all unrighteousness. This is verses 28 through 32, chapter 1, where he's continuing to describe this problem. And he goes through this long list of manifestations of this root problem. Okay, there are countless manifestations of this human problem of fallenness. And I, in my study, picked a few of these, just sort of cherry-picked from this list. And maybe just for a moment, let's try to tie back how these specific manifestations relate to this problem when it comes to worship, okay? So let's start with this one. How about greed? Just take a few of these. How does greed relate back to this worship problem?
If I'm the king, I deserve all the stuff. I mean, people aren't giving me my appropriate due. And,
Yeah.
I want that.
Yeah. I'm the king. There should be no limit to what I have.
Well, I think that's, I'm sorry, I'm coming off again a little bit, but that's the nature, like, as God, he has everything, and he's over everything. We have nothing. And so we agree, we want what we don't have, like we want and we demand instead of
Yep.
really
And we're not really content to simply be receivers of the true king and to be receivers of what the true king deems appropriate for us, whatever our allotment is. We always want, do we want more or less of what we have?
Less, always.
Yeah, right. More, right? Okay, so greed. Todd, you hearing up? Yeah.
Well, a lot of the stuff, when you look at it, talk about being a symptom or, whatever else, it's trying to fill a hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe not every, well, I'd probably say every time, it's filling the hole. You're operating in a lie. The result of operating is you're trying to fill the hole that's already filled if you open your eyes.
Yep. We say all the time, like, you have what you need, Heard one say years ago, when you're scrambling around your house, you're running late and you can't find your keys. Then you go like this, and the whole time they've been in your pocket. Greed, envy. How about that one? What would you say about that one? How does that relate back to this issue of worship? Similarly.
Idolatry. When you keep saying godliness, ungodliness, and the Greek form of it is almost, to me, like worship and idolatry.
It is.
Different.
Yep.
Sort of the same thing, but
Yep.
different connotation. When you have, worship being legitimate, idolatry being false.
Yep.
And the envy, same thing. You're looking at something else that somebody else has, or something you think you need.
Yep.
I'm thinking of the word comparison. That's something that always causes trouble.
Yep. The comparison game, the keeping up with the Joneses, the looking, however you want to describe
Or
it.
feeling cheated
Feeling cheated.
and hating the fact that other people have what you
Yep.
should.
Yep. And it
even
goes back to-
physical characteristics,
Sure.
the envy or the anger, on and on and on, that comparison is.
And it always goes back, does it not, to the dispenser, the giver,
Right.
the sovereign provider. Okay, he didn't do, he didn't give, he didn't dole out the goods the way he should have. I should have more than I have. I should have what that person has. And we can keep going for the sake of time. I don't think I'm going to go too much farther, but murder, deceit, slander, arrogance, unloving, unmerciful. I mean, let's take even that one. Let's just, because it might be a little less obvious, but let's just jump ahead here. But let's take unmerciful. What about that one? How would that relate to this issue of failing to worship, failing to see God's value, failing to revere Him as He deserves? So take the idea of lack of mercy. How does that connect?
Passing judgment, lack of reverence, not appreciating, whatever, just as you're created in your own way, so are they, or whatever else. Ultimately, you're wanting to pass judgment as if you are in control. It's funny because people show their animals more mercy than they show their friends.
Yeah, right. Right? Absolutely. Yep. So it all goes back to this inverted value system, which begins as that root. Failure to just see, appreciate, and be content, and be enthralled with who our Creator is as He presents Himself through creation, through His Word, through the gospel specifically. So that's the human problem, and the gospel is the antidote, or it conveys the antidote of that problem. So part of what I want us to see and where I'm leading us is and remember I said in the beginning, it's like you take, when you look at these terms, it's kind of like, here's what I was describing earlier, maybe the way to illustrate it would be, so if this, let's say this represents Paul's letter, okay, to the Romans. Really, I should have written a scroll. This is a modern version of what it would look like, a book, okay? So here's this, let's just say this same word occurs here, and here, and here, and here, at different points throughout his letter. Well, it's interesting, and you're like, wait a minute, look at each one of those in its context, and what is this picture that emerges? So that's what we're sort of doing as we've been jumping around a bit, and as much as possible, trying to stay within context here to develop and understand that term. Well, let's go to one last place, okay? Let's go to Romans 11. And let's read verse 26 of Romans 11, and then I'll say some things about the context of Romans 11. And I'll just read it here because I think this translation, I'm pretty sure most of them use the same term, but this one's particularly helpful in the clear reference to the Old Testament. But it says, Romans 11:26, it says, "And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will remove ungodliness from Jacob." Ungodliness, there's the term again. It's that asavia. It's this one. Just like in chapter 1, verse 18. Same word, okay? In the context of Romans 11, Paul is speaking about his what's the word I want here? The Jewish people, his heritage. He's speaking about the people who meant a great deal to him as himself being a Jew who came to see the Messiah, Jesus, for who he was. His heart's desire for Israel is that they would be what? Saved. He makes that explicitly clear. And in that discussion of national Israel and Paul's desire for them to be saved, he also speaks to this promise that the deliverer, and he's quoting Isaiah 59, the deliverer, the redeemer, the Messiah will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. So for starters, the Messiah, really, I think it's the term redeemer, and he uses the word deliverer, okay? Is that how it's spelled in all of these? I think so. Deliverer will come and remove how would you now translate that word? Because it's translated this way. Ungodliness from Jacob, which is another, obviously that's one of the patriarchs, and he's using that in place of talking about Jewish people, right? Jewish people who have, to that point, failed to see the Messiah. But how would you, so now how do you understand that? That he will remove ungodliness. How might you translate that in light of what we've looked at contextually?
Lack of reverence.
Lack of reverence, lack of worship. So, remember this from the very beginning. Gospel is God's ability, God's power. How is the worship problem solved? Who solves the worship problem? Go ahead again. Go ahead, Sunday school.
We get
Answer
three
people. Come on. Yeah. There you go. What are the? I mean, how is that striking you right now? For me, it sounds, it's so simple, but yet, in my estimation, at least in my experience, has frequently been missed. Because the way I naturally tend to think, and the way I naturally tend to feel, as if, especially when I hear a term like this, that I am being challenged to do something about this problem. Do I have the power or ability to do something about that problem? Who does? Only God does. Only Christ the deliverer. He's the one who removes non-worship. Irreverence, whatever term you want to use. The gospel is the good news about the unveiling of God's righteousness, which then shows us who our deliverer is and his heart toward us in our miserable idolatry, enslaving lusts, the wreckage of all that we're all very familiar with. Here is a God who says, I have committed myself to your deliverance, and I am the one who will deliver you. And I'm the only one who has the ability, the power to do so. And any thinking or feeling on your part that somehow it is up to you or you can do that, you are delusional. And you will only, what your flesh is inclined to do is take one idol and replace it with another. Maybe take a religious or irreligious idol and replace it with a religious idol, or whatever. What Paul is enthralled with, and what he is just presenting all these different ways, all these different nuances and shades and terms he's using, just pointing over. Christ is this deliverer to be seen, to be known, to be worshipped. Like God wins your worship back. He solves the worship problem by showing you his worthiness, his value, by convincing you of, persuading you of his value. And we learn of his value in a whole different host of ways, whether it's through literally just studying, we learn of it through our life experience, we learn of it through successes, we learn of it through failures, we learn of it through when things are going well with our family, we learn it when things are going horribly with our family. In each and every one of these life experiences, we have a God who's committed to addressing and remedying that problem. What is that? What's that do for you?
So my mind's going to how this idea of worship has done more damage in the church about people thinking, we often ask, how do you walk with God? But the question is, how is your worship? What's really neat about the new covenant you know, back in the day, you know, in the Old Testament, you had the priests, you had the worshipers, you had all these segregated groups, and the gospel says you are all that. You know, you are a priest, you are a worshiper, and we've basically been qualified at those levels to not be frustrated anymore of not being that. Christ has made us that. And, you know, that big list, I don't know if it's wrong, the greed, envy, all that stuff is,
Yeah.
that's kind of like always attacking us to make us non-worshipers, basically.
I would say it's a manifestation of, and this is what we're talking about in the sermon this morning, but it's a manifestation of the flesh, and the flesh is by wiring, the flesh is this way, isn't it? I mean, this is flesh. This is what the flesh, this is all the flesh can do. This is the only quote-unquote ability the flesh has, is to invent countless iterations of this same heart-level problem. So yeah, as we bump into these in our lives, even as Christians, it's like the warning light on your dashboard saying, hey, the flesh is operative here. Flesh is doing its thing, and we all, again, to varying degrees, suffer from that even in this life. And we're going to talk about that in the sermon, Romans 7 this morning. But so I'd say it's a manifestation, like rather than when this occurs in my life, me saying, wow, something's enticing me to engage in false worship, it's like, well, no, this is occurring because I've already succumbed to false worship. Does that make sense? So I think in my mind, that's the way in terms of like, if you try to put an order on it, I would think of it in that sense. It is still, in a scandalous way, the gospel is scandalous because it keeps confronting you with, it's like this, and I'll say it later, but remember Paul's Damascus Road experience, right? Where he's on his horse and he's literally on his way to persecute, kill Christians. And Jesus confronts him and knocks him off his horse. And while that only happened one time in Paul's life, in terms of Paul's conversion, that happened one time, and the actual appearance of Jesus to him, one time. However, you could say there's a sense in which that happened a number of times in Paul's life, countless times in Paul's life, and the same with our lives. Because every time we bump into ourselves and this stuff, the whole list, which is not even an exhaustive list, it is that continual reminder of, oh yeah, that's my flesh, that's my nature, that's my blinders, and at least my testimony is, I think you would say the same, somehow, some way, it just seems that God is faithful to continue to remind me, to show me who He is, His faithfulness, His love, His mercy, His grace, His covering, His provision, His power. In one sense, when we succumb to this, and I'm going to quote this at the end of the sermon, but there's a pastor I heard years ago, and I thought this was a helpful statement, though it is shocking. You have to think carefully about it. But he says, your sin is a great gift to you when you know it. How in the world can sin be a gift to you? Well, the key phrase there is when you know it. When you're aware of it. When you see it for what it is. When you call it what it is. Even that. Because it reminds us of our inability and God's sole ability. And this God, with the only one who has the ability, the only one who has life within himself, the only one who has love, the only one who has freedom, He's committed to granting that to His children through Christ, and has done it decisively, positionally, and continues to open our eyes to what He's done. Yeah, go ahead, Amanda. Do you have your hand up?
And I think seeing it as, like, instead of like things that we need to do, when you see it as worship, and looking at it, some things you can't change, like it is, you do see God's power, like it is Him, like only can change it. And I was thinking about David saying, create in me a clean heart. There's this desire to be changed, and God can do that.
Yep.
There is power in that. It's
Yep.
amazing, and we can't. That's why we call
Yep.
out to Him, and He says He'll give us the heart of flesh, change the heart of stone to heart of flesh. We can't do that.
Yep. And then when we find, which I hope you guys have had the experience where there's been some some freedom or a perspective shift or a lightness where there used to be heaviness or whatever it is, we can in those moments recognize, hey, there has been a gracious provision of God in my life that has helped me to see more clearly, to see according to truth, right? And so that change is evidence of His Spirit, evidence of grace, which is just a different perspective than the transactional, or, and I'm going to talk about this again in the sermon, but what I would call kind of like the dog whistle to the flesh that we often hear in church land, at least in my experience, where you just sort of like this continual sense of obligation, this continual like speaking to, oh yeah, you have a little bit. Yeah, you don't have ability, but you have some ability. You know, you need God's help, but you're kind of giving some, and He's giving some. And like, no, you have zero ability. And so when there's been a deliverance of an experiential kind, hey, it's something to be grateful for there. And it's a true work of God, and to varying degrees we experience that throughout life, and even as Paul will show in Romans 7, until we're home, there will always be, the flesh will always be the flesh. The flesh will always be characterized by this. The flesh doesn't, there's a guy in Bible college who's talking about, you put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig, right? It's like, the flesh is always a pig, okay? So, there you go. You're welcome. This is why, by the way, gospel-centered approach, I don't mean to make that like some formula, but just seeing God for who He is, like that's the point. That's the point of church, that's the point of music, that's the point, this shows who God is. Is your root problem is a worship problem, the only solution is God rescuing you from your worship problem by showing you His worthiness of worship. And through Christ, He's done that. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for this time, thank you for the conversation and the endless opportunities in study of your word to explore truth, to see the different nuances and shades of truth that you imparted to us through a human author and through his choice of words, his use of language. Thank you for the gift that it is to explore and discover these truths, and to be reminded once again, to be pointed back to the beauty and glory of your gospel, your sole ability through Christ to rescue your people. And we thank you that we get to be those people. We thank you that you've awakened us to your kindness and your value, and pray that you help us to experience those moments of gratitude and worship and fruitfulness, and to just be grateful. So thank you for what you've taught us this morning, or reminded us of this morning, and pray for more of the same as we head into our service in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, guys, good conversation. Always willing to follow up anytime.
How are you doing?
One-on-one.
Feeling super.